The mist clung to the ancient pines like a shroud, wrapping the narrow dirt road that snaked up into the heart of the Appalachians. Benjamin Harper gripped the wheel of his battered truck, his calloused hands steady despite the uneven terrain that jostled his two daughters in the back seat. Sarah, the elder at 22, stared out at the endless green blur, her mind replaying the hurried departure from their old life in the valley below, whispers of debts unpaid, neighbors' sidelong glances, and father's insistent promise of a fresh start in the family cabin, untouched for decades. Beside her, young Eliza, barely 19, fidgeted with the hem of her faded dress, the air thick with unspoken questions. The engine's rumble drowned out the faint rustle of leaves, but as dusk fell, something else stirred, soft murmurs from the shadows, like echoes of forgotten arguments carried on the wind. Benjamin's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, a faint smile curling his lips as if he alone understood the language of the forest. The cabin loomed ahead, its weathered boards groaning under the weight of secrets long buried, and as they crossed the threshold, the door creaked shut behind them with a finality that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. Little did they know, the voices in the dark were just beginning to awaken, drawing them into a web of intimacy and terror that would bind them in ways unimaginable. The truck lurched over the last rutted stretch of road, tires spitting gravel as the dense canopy of oaks and hemlocks closed overhead like a living tunnel. Benjamin Harper eased off the gas, letting the engine idle while he scanned the narrowing path ahead, his broad shoulders filling the cab and casting long shadows over the two young women huddled in the back seat. The move had come suddenly, too suddenly for Sarah's liking. One week they were still in the small valley town where neighbors waved from porches and the girls worked odd shifts at the diner. The next, Benjamin announced they were leaving it all behind for the old family cabin deep in the Appalachians, a place no one had lived in since his own father passed 20 years earlier. He spoke of debts, of prying eyes, of needing space to breathe clean air away from the poison of the lowlands, but his voice carried an edge that silenced questions before they formed. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching the world shrink to nothing but twisting vines and moss-covered boulders. At 22, she had learned to read her father's moods the way hunters read tracks, the tightening of his jaw when money ran short, the way his eyes lingered too long when he thought no one noticed. Beside her, Eliza clutched a worn quilt to her chest, 19 and still wide-eyed enough to believe father's promises of a simpler life. The truck creaked as Benjamin shifted gears, climbing higher into folds of the mountains where cell signals died and the nearest neighbor was miles of ridgeline away. When the cabin finally emerged from the mist, it looked smaller than Sarah remembered from childhood visits, little more than a squat box of darkened logs hunched against the slope, its tin roof patched with rust and its single chimney leaning like a weary sentinel. Vines had claimed the porch rails, and the windows stared out like hollow eyes. Benjamin killed the engine and sat motionless for a moment, listening to the sudden hush that swallowed them. Somewhere in the distance a crow called once, then nothing. He turned in his seat, his weathered face softening into the smile he reserved for moments like this, moments when he believed he was saving them. "This is home now," he said quietly, the words carrying the weight of finality. "No more outsiders telling us how to live. Just us, the land, and the quiet." His gaze moved from Sarah to Eliza and back again, lingering in a way that made Sarah's skin prickle despite the chill seeping through the truck's old seals. She forced a nod, swallowing the unease that had been growing since the night he loaded their belongings without explanation. Eliza offered a small, trusting smile, already reaching for the door handle. As they stepped out into the damp mountain air, the scent of pine and wet earth enveloped them, thick and ancient. Benjamin unloaded rifles and traps from the truck bed with practiced efficiency, stacking them against the cabin wall as if preparing for a long siege. The isolation pressed in immediately, no hum of distant traffic, no flicker of porch lights from neighboring homes, only the endless rustle of leaves and the faint, almost imperceptible whisper of wind threading through the trees. Sarah paused on the threshold, one hand on the rough-hewn doorframe, feeling the cabin exhale decades of stillness around her. Behind her, Benjamin's boots crunched on the gravel as he approached, his presence filling the space like smoke. The first night in the cabin settled over them like a heavy quilt, thick and suffocating. After unloading the last of the boxes by lantern light, Benjamin barred the door with a thick oak beam, claiming it was to keep out bears or wandering drifters. The girls said little, exhaustion pulling at their limbs as they claimed narrow beds in the loft above the main room. Sarah lay rigid beneath a threadbare blanket, listening to the house adjust to their presence, beams creaking, floorboards sighing, the faint drip of condensation from the tin roof. Eliza fell asleep quickly, her breathing soft and even, but Sarah's eyes stayed fixed on the knotty pine ceiling, tracing shadows cast by the dying embers below. Hours slipped by, the kind of deep country hours that stretch longer than anywhere else. Somewhere past midnight, the wind rose, threading through the needles outside and making the ancient trees speak in low, rustling tones. Then came the whispers. At first Sarah thought it was the wind playing tricks, shaping itself into half-formed words as it slipped through cracks in the logs. But the sounds grew distinct, rising from the darkness beyond the window glass, soft murmurs that carried the cadence of conversation, though no words were clear. They seemed to drift up from the forest floor, circling the cabin like smoke, sometimes close enough to brush against the panes. Sarah sat up slowly, careful not to wake Eliza. She crept to the small loft window and peered out. Moonlight filtered through the canopy in silver shards, painting the ground in shifting patterns, but nothing moved among the trunks. No lantern glow, no silhouette of a late-night hiker. Only the endless sway of branches and the persistent, intimate whispering that now seemed to come from every direction at once. It wasn't loud, never loud enough to rouse Benjamin downstairs, whose snores rumbled steady and deep, but it was insistent, weaving through the night air like threads of a half-remembered lullaby gone wrong. Downstairs, the fire had burned low, casting faint orange flickers up the ladder rungs. Sarah considered waking her father, telling him about the voices, but something held her back. He would only smile that knowing smile, say it was owls or foxes, or perhaps the mountain itself welcoming them home. Instead she stayed at the window, arms wrapped around herself against the chill seeping through the glass. The whispers ebbed and flowed, occasionally rising into a clearer murmur, a woman's voice, perhaps, or a child's, then dissolving again into the wind. Eliza stirred in her sleep, murmuring something incoherent, and for a moment Sarah wondered if her sister heard them too. By the time the first pale hint of dawn crept over the ridges, the voices had faded entirely, leaving only the ordinary sounds of morning birds and dripping dew. Sarah told herself it had been exhaustion, the strange acoustics of the hollow, anything but what her skin still remembered, the feeling of being listened to by something hidden in the dark. She lay back down as Eliza began to wake, the whispers already retreating into the corners of her mind like dreams too fragile to hold in daylight. But deep in the bones of the mountain, the voices waited, patient and ancient, gathering strength for the nights yet to come. A week passed in the rhythm of chores and silence, the days bleeding into one another under the perpetual grey of mountain clouds. Sarah found herself drawn to the attic more often than she cared to admit, climbing the narrow pull-down ladder when Benjamin was out checking traps and Eliza napped downstairs. The space was low-ceilinged and choked with dust, lit only by a single grimy dormer window that looked out over the endless ridges. Trunks and crates crowded the floorboards, relics of generations who had lived and died in this hollow, faded photographs in cracked frames, rusted tools, bundles of yellowed letters tied with twine. It was on a rain-lashed afternoon that she pried open the smallest trunk, wedged beneath a stack of moth-eaten quilts. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a leather-bound journal no larger than her hand, its cover cracked and darkened with age. The pages crackled as she opened them, releasing a faint scent of mildew and something sharper, like old smoke. The handwriting was spidery but deliberate, dated entries stretching back to the 1930s, penned by a woman named Clara Harper, Benjamin's great-aunt, if the family stories were true. At first the words seemed ordinary, records of harvests, births, the harsh winter of '38 that took 3 children in the valley below. But as Sarah turned the pages, the tone shifted. Clara wrote of her father's moods, how he spoke of bloodlines needing to stay pure, how outsiders carried sickness in their hearts. Entries grew shorter, more frantic. She described nights when her brother, Benjamin's grandfather, was summoned to their father's room, the thin walls doing little to muffle sounds that made Clara press her pillow over her ears. Phrases appeared again and again: the circle must not break, what is ours stays ours, the mountain keeps its own. Sarah's breath caught as she read a passage dated spring 1941. Clara confessed to discovering her father with her younger sister, the girl only 14, and how he justified it as tradition, as necessity in a world that would scatter the family like leaves. Clara wrote of trying to run, of being brought back by search parties led by her own kin, of the shame that silenced her forever after. The final entries dissolved into pleas scrawled in fading ink, warnings to any who might find the book. The darkness was not in the woods but in the blood, passed down like eye color or the shape of a hand. Rain drummed harder on the tin roof overhead as Sarah sat back on her heels, the journal trembling in her grip. Dust motes swirled in the weak light, and for a moment she thought she heard the whispers again, rising faintly from the pages themselves. She glanced toward the attic ladder, half expecting Benjamin's shadow to appear, but the house remained quiet save for the storm. Carefully, she closed the book, her fingers lingering on the worn cover as if it burned. The weight of what she had read settled over her like the damp air seeping through the rafters, threading connections she did not yet want to name between the past and the watchful way her father sometimes looked at her and Eliza when he thought they weren't paying attention. She slid the journal back into its oilcloth, but the words stayed with her, burrowing deep, waiting for the long nights ahead. The first snow came early that year, a thin dusting that turned to slush underfoot and made the dirt track down the mountain treacherous. Benjamin had been watching the sky for days, his eyes narrowing at every shift in the clouds, and when the flakes began to fall in earnest he declared it a sign. The girls needed protecting, he said, protecting from slick roads, from strangers who might take advantage of the weather to wander too close, from the world that had already tried to pull them apart. Sarah watched him from the kitchen window as he trudged out to the truck with a wrench and a length of chain, his breath pluming in the cold. Eliza was inside rolling dough for cornbread, humming softly under her breath, oblivious to the deliberate way Benjamin knelt beside the rear axle. Sarah's stomach tightened as she recognized the motions, loosening bolts, prying at the brake line with careful precision. She pressed closer to the frosted glass, her breath fogging the pain. When he stood and wiped his hands on his trousers, the truck sat lower on one side, subtly crippled. He tested the tire with a boot, nodding to himself as if satisfied with a job well done. That evening he gathered them by the fire, his face grave in the flickering light. The roads were icing over, he told them. He'd gone to move the truck closer to the woodshed and discovered the damage, brake line severed clean, probably by a sharp rock kicked up on the drive-in. Could have been catastrophic if they'd tried to leave. His voice carried regret, but his eyes held something steadier, almost relieved. They were stuck now, truly stuck, until spring thaw or until he decided otherwise. No point risking their lives on those switchbacks with faulty brakes. Eliza's face fell. She had been talking about driving down for flour and sugar once the storm passed. Sarah said nothing, only stared into the flames, feeling the cabin shrink around them. Benjamin reached out and squeezed Eliza's shoulder, then Sarah's, his grip lingering a fraction too long. "We've got plenty laid in," he murmured. "Meat in the smoker, roots in the cellar, jars from last summer. We don't need anyone else." Outside, the snow thickened, erasing the last visible stretch of road until only white emptiness remained beyond the porch. Days turned into weeks with no attempt at repair. Benjamin spent hours in the shed sharpening tools, checking traps, bringing back rabbits and the occasional deer that he dressed with quiet efficiency. Whenever Sarah offered to hike down for parts or flag a passing ranger, he shook his head gently, reminding her how easy it was to lose the trail in deep snow, how many folks vanished every winter thinking they knew the mountain better than it knew them. The whispers in the night grew bolder, threading through the wind that rattled the shutters, and Sarah began to wonder if the mountain itself was complicit in keeping them here. The truck sat silent under a thickening blanket of white, its ruined parts hidden beneath the hood like a secret too mundane to question. Isolation settled deeper, wrapping the cabin in layers of ice and silence, until the only footsteps in the snow were Benjamin's, circling the perimeter each dawn and dusk as though guarding something precious from the world he had finally shut out. The nights grew longer as winter tightened its grip, the sun barely cresting the ridges before sinking again into bruised purple skies. Sleep became a fragile thing for Sarah, fractured by the cold that seeped through the quilts and by the whispers that now seemed to follow her even when she closed her eyes. Eliza, too, began to toss in her narrow bed across the loft, her breathing uneven, small sounds escaping her lips as if she argued with someone unseen. It started with dreams that felt too vivid, too deliberate. Sarah would find herself standing at the edge of the clearing, barefoot in snow that didn't burn, watching figures move between the trees, women in long dresses, children with hollow faces, all turning toward her with mouths forming silent accusations. Their voices threaded directly into her mind, not through ears but through bone. Why do you stay? Why do you let it begin again? She would wake gasping, the loft spinning, only to hear Eliza murmuring the same fragmented pleas in her sleep. One night the boundary thinned entirely. Sarah jolted upright, heart hammering, certain someone had spoken her name inches from her ear. The room was dark, the fire below long reduced to embers, yet the air felt crowded. Eliza sat bolt upright too, eyes wide and glassy, staring at the foot of her bed. "They're here," she whispered, voice small and cracked. "They keep asking why we don't run." Sarah reached for her sister's hand and found it ice-cold, trembling. For a long moment they sat frozen, listening to the hush that pressed against the cabin walls, a hush too complete, as though the mountain itself held its breath. The dreams returned night after night, each more insistent. Sarah saw Clara from the journal, younger, pressing the leather book into her hands across a century, eyes pleading. She saw other faces, girls with her own cheekbones, her own dark hair, standing in this same loft, backs against the wall while footsteps climbed the ladder. The voices layered over one another, sometimes angry, sometimes sorrowful, always urgent. He will say it's love. He will say it's protection. Do not believe him. Eliza began waking with bruises on her arms she couldn't explain, faint fingerprints that faded by morning. She stopped speaking of the dreams aloud, but Sarah caught her staring at their father during supper, fork paused halfway to her mouth, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. During the days they moved like sleepwalkers, chopping wood, hauling water, mending clothes, while the boundary between waking and not blurred at the edges. Benjamin noticed none of it, or pretended not to, humming as he skinned game, telling stories of his own childhood in these hills as though the past were something warm and harmless. But when he looked at them now, his gaze lingered heavier, possessive, and Sarah felt the voices surge in response, a chorus rising in her blood. The nightmares no longer felt like warnings from outside, they felt like memories trying to surface, like inherited grief sharpening itself into weapon. Each dawn she woke exhausted, the line between what was real and what was dream thinning to a thread, while the mountain watched and waited for the moment that thread would finally snap. The thaw hinted at spring but brought only mud and malaise, the snow melting into rivulets that carved gullies down the slope and turned the clearing into a slick bog. Supplies dwindled despite Benjamin's assurances, flour gone moldy, the last of the salt pork rationed thin, and whispers of town filtered through the girls' minds like smoke under the door. Sarah had taken to watching the tree line for any sign of passage, a ranger's truck or a lost hiker, while Eliza's nightmares left her pale and clinging to the daylight hours. It was late afternoon when the crunch of tires on gravel announced the impossible. A county sheriff's jeep emerged from the mist-shrouded pines, its lights cutting through the gray like accusatory eyes. Sheriff Harlan Reed stepped out, broad-brimmed hat dripping, his boots sinking into the muck as he approached the porch. He had come on a welfare check, he said, after a trapper down the ridge reported no smoke from the chimney in weeks and strange lights flickering at night. Folks in the valley were talking, wondering if the Harpers were holed up or hurt. Benjamin met him at the door, wiping his hands on a rag stained with deer blood, his smile easy and disarming as fresh-churned butter. He invited the sheriff in for coffee, the fire crackling welcomingly as if the cabin itself played host. Sarah hovered in the kitchen shadows, heart pounding, while Eliza sat wide-eyed at the table, twisting her apron. Here was their chance, outsiders, authority, a way to voice the unease that had rooted deeper than the ancient oaks outside. But Benjamin spun the tale smoothly. The girls were fine, he said, just adjusting to mountain life after the chaos below, debts, bad influences, a need for family closeness away from it all. He gestured to the stocked shelves, the mended quilts, the rifles cleaned and oiled. Sarah opened her mouth, the journal's warnings burning on her tongue, but Benjamin's eyes flicked to her with a warmth that masked steel, reminding her of shared blood, of loyalty. The sheriff nodded, sipping the bitter brew, asking Eliza if she was happy here. She stammered yes, glancing at her father, the voices from her dreams echoing faint accusations she dared not heed. Reed poked around politely, the loft ladder, the shed with its hanging carcasses, but Benjamin joked about bear tracks and isolation, how the mountain made folks paranoid. He even showed the sabotaged truck, blaming rust and neglect, promising a tow come clearer weather. The sheriff chuckled, charmed by the rugged self-reliance, the way Benjamin spoke of protecting his own in a world gone soft. Seeds of doubt sprouted in the girl's silence. If they spoke now, who would believe them over this pillar of a man, this hunter who knew every trail and turn? As the jeep rumbled away, taillights fading into the fog, Benjamin closed the door with a satisfied thud. He turned to them, praise in his voice for their quiet strength, but Sarah felt the walls close tighter, the whispers rising in mockery from the darkening woods. The visit had come and gone like a ghost, leaving them more entangled than before. The sheriff's departure a seal on their seclusion. Spring crept in slowly, the mud hardening into ruts and the first green shoots pushing through the leaf litter like tentative fingers. Benjamin spent more time away from the cabin now, claiming longer hunting circuits as the deer moved higher with the warming days. The absence gave Sarah fragments of privacy she hoarded like contraband, moments when she could breathe without feeling his gaze settle on her skin. Eliza helped less with chores, retreating to the loft with headaches that left her listless, and Sarah used those quiet stretches to search. It began with the shed. Benjamin kept it locked, but the padlock was old and the hasp loose. A thin knife blade slipped the latch easily. Inside smelled of iron and cured hides, tools hanging in neat rows, shelves lined with jars of powder and shot. Tucked behind a stack of ammunition boxes, she found a small wooden case no bigger than a cigar box, its lid carved with the same interlocking H that marked the journal upstairs. Heart thudding, she carried it back to the cabin while Eliza slept. The case held reels of thin wire and a handheld recorder no larger than a pack of cards, its plastic casing scratched from years of use. Sarah's fingers shook as she pressed play. Static hissed, then her own voice filled the room. Snippets of conversations with Eliza in the loft, laughter over a shared memory from town, Sarah confessing her unease about the move in a whisper she thought private. The recordings continued, Eliza crying softly after a nightmare, Benjamin's low murmur outside the door asking if she needed anything, the creak of floorboards as he lingered. Another reel captured Sarah reading aloud from a book by lantern light, her voice intimate and unguarded. She played reel after reel, each one a violation stitched together from ordinary moments. There were older tapes too, voices she didn't recognize at first, then realized with a sick lurch were their mothers, fragments from before she left, pleading, angry, finally silent. Benjamin had been collecting them for years, curating private hours like trophies. The final reel was recent, Eliza sleep-talking, calling out in distress, and Benjamin's voice closer than it should have been, soothing, too soothing, promising everything would feel right soon. Sarah sat on the cold floorboards until the light shifted across the window, the recorder heavy in her lap. The manipulation was methodical, patient, every vulnerability catalogued, every doubt preserved to be replayed when needed. She understood now how he anticipated their fears, how he always knew when to offer comfort that bound tighter than chains. The voices from the dreams surged louder in her ears, no longer distant warnings but echoes of every woman he had recorded, watched, shaped. She wrapped the reels carefully, returned the case exactly as found, but the knowledge settled in her chest like a stone. When Benjamin's boots sounded on the path that evening, she met his smile with one of her own, the recorder's existence burning behind her eyes, waiting for the moment she could turn his own weapon back against the darkness he had so carefully preserved. The air turned thick with summer heat, the kind that pressed against the skin and made every breath feel borrowed. Eliza had grown quieter over the months, her eyes ringed with the purple of sleepless nights, her movements slow as if wading through water no one else could see. Sarah watched her sister fold laundry on the porch one humid afternoon, hands trembling over a shirt that belonged to their father, and something inside her finally fractured. They couldn't wait any longer for a sign or a storm or a miracle. That evening, when Benjamin announced another overnight hunt, tracking a wounded buck deeper into the ridge, Sarah slipped Eliza the small pack she had hidden beneath the floorboards, a canteen, jerked meat, the journal wrapped in oilcloth, a knife. They waited until the lantern light disappeared between the trees, until the crunch of his boots faded into the chorus of katydids. Then Eliza stood at the door, shoulders shaking, whispering that she couldn't, that he would know, that the woods would bring her back just like they always did in the dreams. Sarah took her hand, firm and steady, promising they would stay on the old logging road, follow the creek downstream until it met the county line. They stepped off the porch together, the night swallowing them in layers of pine-scented dark. The forest was louder than Sarah expected, branches snapping underfoot, owls calling overhead, the constant rush of water somewhere to their left. They moved quickly at first, adrenaline sharpening every sense, the cabin shrinking behind them until its outline vanished entirely. Moonlight filtered in pale ribbons, enough to keep them on the faint track worn by decades of deer and occasional loggers. Eliza clung to Sarah's sleeve, breathing ragged, but they covered ground, the air growing cooler as they descended. Then the footsteps began behind them, not hurried, not loud, but deliberate, matching their pace with an ease that chilled the sweat on Sarah's neck. She pulled Eliza faster, thorns tearing at their skirts, roots snagging ankles. The sound stayed with them, sometimes closer, sometimes fading, as if whatever followed toyed with the distance. Eliza whimpered that it was him, that he had circled ahead somehow, that the mountain always gave him back his own. Sarah hushed her, guiding them off the trail into thicker brush, crouching low among ferns that smelled sharp and green. They waited in the dark, hearts hammering against ribs, while the footsteps passed within yards, slow, unhurried, accompanied by the soft click of a rifle bolt eased back into place. No lantern, no call of their names, just the steady tread of someone who knew every inch of these woods and had all night to wait. The mist rose from the ground, cool and cloying, carrying the faint scent of gun oil and cured leather. When the sound finally receded downhill, Sarah pulled Eliza up again, redirecting them cross-slope through a tangle of laurel that clawed at their skin. Hours bled away, the creek louder now but still out of reach, the first hint of dawn graying the sky. Eliza stumbled more often, tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt on her cheeks, begging to rest, to go back before he found them. Sarah's own legs burned, doubt creeping in with every unseen rustle, every imagined shadow pacing alongside. The forest seemed to shift around them, paths looping back on themselves, the mist thickening until the trees blurred into walls of grey. They pressed on, two small figures swallowed by the vastness, pursued by something that wore the shape of pursuit without ever fully revealing itself in the gathering light. The heat of late summer gave way to the first chill of autumn, the leaves turning blood-red and gold as if the mountain itself bled in warning. Sarah and Eliza had returned that dawn after the failed escape, mud-streaked and silent, meeting Benjamin on the porch as he emerged from the trees with his rifle slung casual over one shoulder. He said nothing of where they had been or how he had known to wait, he only opened his arms and drew them inside, murmuring about dreams and disorientation, about how the woods could trick even the surest foot. They did not speak of it again, but the failure hung between them like damp fog, thickening the air inside the cabin until every breath felt shared. It was Eliza who broke first. One evening she lingered by the fire after supper, staring at their father as he cleaned his knife with slow, rhythmic strokes. Tears slipped down her cheeks without sound, and when Benjamin noticed he set the blade aside and pulled her onto his knee as he had when she was small. Sarah watched from the shadows of the kitchen, the journal hidden beneath her apron, every muscle coiled. He spoke softly then, voice low enough that Sarah strained to catch the words, stories of his own childhood, of a father whose hands were heavy with drink and rage, of nights locked in the root cellar until he learned to be quiet, to be good. He told of their mother leaving not because she didn't love them but because the mountain had called her away, because some women couldn't bear the weight of blood that stayed close. His hand stroked Eliza's hair, fingers threading through the dark strands that matched his own, and he spoke of purity, of keeping what was theirs safe from the sickness outside. The words twisted sympathy into something darker, each confession a hook that pulled at pity even as it recoiled the stomach. He wept quietly, shoulders shaking, and Eliza's arms went around him, comforting the man who had hunted them through the night like prey. Sarah felt the voices rise in her throat, furious and grieving, but she stayed silent, watching the way trauma braided itself into justification, how pain could be polished into permission. Later, when Eliza slept fitfully in the loft, Sarah sat by the dying fire and listened to Benjamin pace below. He paused at the ladder, one foot on the bottom rung, and spoke her name, not angry, not pleading, but certain, as if continuing a conversation begun generations ago. He told her he had always known she was the strong one, the one who understood necessity, that the voices she heard were ancestors trying to guide them home. His past spilled out in fragments, the beatings, the isolation, the way violation had been renamed love until he believed it himself. Each revelation was a mirror held up to the present, reflecting back a cycle he claimed they could break only by embracing it fully. Sarah's skin crawled with the intimacy of his confessions, the way he offered his brokenness like a gift that demanded reciprocity. The mountain wind rattled the shutters, carrying the whispers louder than ever, accusatory, heartbroken, pleading for the circle to finally shatter rather than close again. She gripped the edge of her chair, feeling the weight of inherited horror settle into her bones, the thin line between victim and perpetrator blurring in the firelight as Benjamin's voice wove sympathy and horror into a single, unbreakable thread. The first hard frost came early that October, silvering the grass and turning the breath of the 3 remaining souls in the cabin into fleeting ghosts. The air inside had grown thick with unspoken things, Benjamin's confessions hanging like smoke, Eliza's surrender softening into a numb obedience, Sarah's silence sharpening into something lethal. The voices no longer came only at night, they threaded through every waking hour, a constant murmur beneath the crackle of the fire and the scrape of a knife on whetstone. They spoke in layers now, Clara's pleas braided with others older still, urging an end rather than another turning of the wheel. It happened on a night when the moon hung low and orange, the forest silent under its gaze. Benjamin climbed the loft ladder slowly, each rung creaking like a warning unheeded. He carried no lantern, the glow from below outlined him in red, a broad silhouette filling the narrow opening. Eliza sat on her bed, knees drawn to her chest, eyes fixed on the floorboards as if they might open and swallow her whole. Sarah stood between them, the hidden knife from the failed escape now gripped behind her back, its blade cold against her palm. He spoke softly at first, repeating the litany of blood and protection, of how the world outside would tear them apart but here they could keep the circle unbroken. His hands reached for Eliza, gentle in their certainty, drawing her up as she trembled but did not pull away. The voices rose to a roar in Sarah's ears, drowning his words, showing her in flashes every girl who had stood in this loft before, faces like her own, eyes pleading across decades. When Benjamin turned to her, inviting her to join, to understand at last, something inside Sarah snapped clean. She stepped forward, not with the knife yet, but with the recorder she had kept charged on stolen moments near the fire. She pressed play and let the reels speak, his own voice captured in soothing midnight murmurs, Eliza's sleep-drugged whimpers, the fragments of their mother's final pleas. The sound filled the small space, undeniable, a mirror he could not charm away. His face shifted from tender certainty to confusion, then to a raw, animal fury as the voices of his past crimes echoed back at him. Eliza found her own voice then, small but steady, naming what he had done, what he planned still to do. Together they backed him toward the ladder, the chorus of ancestral warnings now a fierce command. He lunged once, hands grasping, but Sarah brought the knife up not to kill, but to cut the final thread of fear that had bound them. The blade flashed across his arm, shallow but enough. He recoiled, shock breaking the spell of his authority. They forced him down the rungs, step by step, until he stood in the main room surrounded by the evidence of his own making, the journal open on the table, the recorder still playing, the door unbarred for the first time in months. The mist outside parted just enough to reveal the faint glow of dawn on the ridge, a path suddenly visible where none had been before. Benjamin looked at them, blood dripping from his sleeve, the mountain's ancient whispers falling silent at last as the circle faced its breaking. Sarah and Eliza stood shoulder to shoulder, no longer daughters in his story but women claiming the only inheritance that mattered, the right to walk away from the darkness he had mistaken for legacy. They stepped past him into the cold, clear air, leaving the cabin door wide behind them, the voices finally quiet in the waking woods.